Hi, welcome back to Chapter 2, First Civilizations. Now we're going to focus on Section 2, the erosion of equality. And this isn't just the formation of class distinctions, but it's also the formation of gender distinctions. So let's start with hierarchies of class. Professional and craft specialization marked early urban life, and these first civilizations had vast inequalities in wealth and status and power that came from that professional and craft specialization. And these civilizations multiplied and magnified inequalities that had already existed in the complex hunting and gathering societies and chiefdoms. Now, those societies, we can refer to the hunting and gathering societies and even the chiefdoms as socially equal in comparison to these first civilizations. Of course, there were some differences, and that comes with different responsibilities and prestige, but these first civilizations really magnified those inequalities. The new levels of inequality represent one of the major turning points in the social history of humankind. The upper classes had great wealth, were able to avoid physical labor, had the finest of everything, and occupied the top positions in political, military, and religious life. They had everything. And the free commoners formed the vast majority of the population, which is similar to that today. And it included artisans of all kinds, lower level officials, soldiers and police, servants and farmers. And their surplus production was appropriated to support the upper classes. That's why it was there. That's why it existed, to support those upper classes. Now, some of the members of these classes recognized and even resented their situation. Slaves, of course, are at the bottom of social hierarchies everywhere. Slavery and civilization seem to have emerged together. That's what many historians and anthropologists believe. And the first generation of slaves were prisoners of war, criminals, and even debtors. They worked in fields, mines, homes, and shops. And more rarely were they actually sacrificed. And slavery varied from place to place. It just depended on the location. And most ancient slavery is rather different from the most recent American variety. Okay, hierarchies of gender. Civilizations everywhere undermined the earlier and more equal relationships between men and women. But the women in the horticultural societies remained relatively equal to men. But patriarchy gradually emerged in the first civilizations. The more intensive agriculture with animal-drawn plows, large dairy herds favored male labor over female labor, and so males were viewed as more important because of their duties and responsibilities and the necessities of that. Patriarchy also developed in civilization without plow agriculture, such as Mesoamerica and the Andes. And David Christian, he believes that women's declining position is really a product of a growing social complexity. And that makes sense. As more complex that social aspects of civilization became, that led to women's decline in position. The association of women with nature because of their role in reproduction, may have also played a role. Warfare has obviously contributed to patriarchy, and private property and commerce also may have played a role. And last but not least, the need to restrict female sexual activities to ensure the inheritance by the father's offspring. Now, it's important to understand the difference between sex versus gender. Sex refers to biological distinctions between males and females in a given species, and gender refers to the social construction of male and female identities. So, sex has to do with the biological distinctions, and gender has to do with the social construction of males and females. So, two words that are not synonymous of each other, but commonly mistakenly are used that way. Now, patriarchal ideal versus reality. Most cultures expressed patriarchal ideal of male supremacy, but the reality of that often reflected a wider diversity of experiences. Women could find ways to exercise that outside of the ideal form. And as mentioned earlier, farm labor, warfare, property. In trying to explain the origins of gender inequality, some scholars have looked to that heavy farm labor, while others have talked about the importance of male warriors, and even pointed toward the concerns of property inheritance and lineage. Now, patriarchy in practice. A noted historian, Austrian historian Gerda Lerner, very important historian, who in the 20th century was well known for her work in women's and gender history. Now, she focused on the emergence of patriarchy in Mesopotamia. There were written law codes that organized or codified patriarchal family life, so their laws and how they lived focused on that patriarchal family life, that patriarchy style of living. There was even regulation of female sexuality that was the central focus of life and law. Women in Mesopotamia were sometimes divided into two sharply distinguished categories, depending on the protection of one man. And the law on female sexuality, because male lawmakers were really concerned with property and inheritance, those early laws developed that governed women's sexual behavior with harsh punishment for those female transgressors because of their concern with property and inheritance. And they were male lawmakers. Respectable and non-respectable women, social ideals often focused on respectable women who might be veiled like they were in Assyria, yet there were frequently classes of non-respectable women, such as prostitutes and slaves who lived outside of those controlling social norms. And there was also a decline in the powerful goddesses of Mesopotamia as they were gradually replaced by male deities. Now, the decline of the goddesses in many of the early societies, male deities were tied to wisdom and warfare, and that really replaced the female goddesses that were tied to agriculture, because as societies became more complex, wisdom, warfare, law, that became more important than agriculture or reproduction. Now, Egyptian patriarchy gave women greater opportunities than in most of the first civilizations, including the ability to own property and own slaves, They could administer and sell land. They could make their own wills, sign their own marriage contracts, and even initiate divorce. And the royal women occasionally wielded political power as regents for their sons until their sons came of age, and some even as queens in their own right. That was rare, but that was possible. Okay, and that's the end of section 2.